G'day everyone and welcome to this week's episode with Jamie Christopherson. What an excellent conversation this was. You are going to love this conversation. If you are thinking about how do I optimize the next 5 years in my business, how do I make sure I'm focused on the right things, that my business is going to be a better business in 5 years' time than it is today, it's going to be more competitive, it's going to be more compelling, my people are going to be fully engaged, we're going to really succeed in sort of optimizing everything in our business in terms of the way that we create value for our customers, our growth rates, everything, then you have to be thinking about strategy. And strategy could be as simple in the early days as, back of the envelope stuff. But as your business gets bigger, you actually have to start thinking about it in a bit more of a sophisticated way. So I've brought in Jamie today, who is he's my guy on strategy. He is excellent. And he's done some incredible work with some great organizations. And he's really going to unpack for you the way he thinks about taking people through a process around strategy, because he's an expert sort of facilitator. So he's going to talk to you about the process, but he's also going to talk to you about a lot of the principles. How do you really think about strategy? How do you think about the link between strategy and execution? How do you mobilize your team, hearts, minds, and all the rest? And then what's the link back to that? What's the feedback loop that helps you make sure that execution is informing future strategy? Great conversation, heaps to learn. You're going to love it. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where each week you get to hear Sean Steele, professional CEO, growth mentor, and advisory board chair, unpack the strategies that successful founders have used to achieve scale in their businesses. Stay tuned as he interviews the entrepreneurs who've made it, learns from industry experts, and follows a group of founders still striving to scale.
G'day everyone and welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where we help first-time founders learn the secrets of scaling so they can fulfill the potential of their businesses, make bigger decisions with greater confidence, and maximize the value and impact they can have in the world. I am your host, Sean Steele, and my guest today is Jamie Christopherson, Director at Maximus International. How are you today, Jamie?
Really well, thank you, Sean. How are you? Long
The
time
audience
coming.
can hear me giggling because you and I have been trying to have this conversation for I don't know how long, 6 months, multiple technical issues, hilarious. I'm just super glad that we're finally having this conversation. It's great. Maybe a bit of background for those who don't know you, Jamie. I'll just have a quick crack. I mean, because you are now director at Maximus International, and we were introduced by Robbie Sharon-Zipser, the CEO of publicly listed High Pages. For those who haven't heard that episode 23, go back and have a listen. Fascinating. Actually, I did 2 episodes with Robbie, so you'll find another one shortly after that, unpacking debt and equity structures and a whole bunch of things. But Robbie had been through a pretty major transformation, and he'd said that you were pivotal in the transition from their I think they were around 25 mil or something, and things had flattened out and they needed help. And then, 5 years later, they're at 55 mil. And so I thought, wow, what a, it's a fascinating journey they'd been on. But one of the reasons I was so interested to chat to you is he kept referring back to how he'd got really clear on his strategy, and how he'd reorganized his team and the accountability models and the line of sight to the deliverables to the strategy and the cadence and the rhythm, and that you'd played a really key role in all that. And, we're not going to be able to unpack every element of that in the half an hour or so that we've got. But I think, we don't usually spend much time talking. We talk a lot to founders on this show who've implemented their own strategies, but we don't get to chat to that many people who actually help founders implement strategy and think about strategy differently. And because you see so many patterns and so many companies, you get just great insight, I think, about stuff that works and stuff that, can be left to the side. So that's really the goal of our conversation today. I just really want to bring a different perspective to, you've got a whole bunch of founders listening to us today who are thinking about how do I optimize my next 5 years and make it as meaningful as possible, waste the least amount of time as possible, make it as, maximize my growth rates and profitability and competitive advantage and all the other stuff. How do we help them do that? So maybe to kick off, Jamie, you could just give us a quick insight into, what you're now doing at Maximus, just to create a bit of context, and then we'll jump in.
Thanks, Sean. And listen, I wish you could follow me around everywhere with that articulate background story to myself. So grateful for that. And I often just like to think of my role as, really traffic control for really smart people in many regards. Listen, I've been in consulting since the early 2000s, and really starting off my career in strategy and having deep passion for how value migrates from getting the right people on board to then coming up with a customer value prop, to then making some money out of it, to then trying to do it again the next year and the next year in a sustainable way. And in the work that I've done around strategy, what I've really discovered over time is that the organizations that really knock the lights out on their strategy and achieve their outcomes in the longer term, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, have always over-indexed on getting the human element connected with strategy. So making sure
Right.
that strategy is not an academic exercise, but one that taps into the heart, the guts, and the hands. It's all too often I've seen that someone has the world's best strategy, has beautiful graphic design, it's PDF'd,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
perfectly
150
meticulously,
pages,
yeah, 150
beautifully
pages just to
bound.
make sure that it's right. And it's sent out by a CEO or an MD or an exec team with a carefully scripted message. And then we hope for the best that it will just, take shape and form, and everyone will, by magic, know what to do in terms of mobilizing
Mm.
to execute. So really,
Hmm.
you know, over time, I really started to discover in the work that I was doing around strategy was that, you know, an executive team would stop saying we have all the answers and saying, actually, we're actually furthest removed from our employees. We're furthest removed from our
Mm.
customers and clients.
Customers, yeah.
We actually need to get close to our people who are dealing with who are managing our staff every day, who are out there representing our brand and our customer value prop. And so throughout my career, Sean, it's really been the interplay between strategy and leadership. And I kind of almost think of it like an off season and an on season. I don't know which one is which, but I find that
Mm.
the combination of working with executive teams and boards to, really synthesize a lot of intelligence into a cohesive and coherent story um, that is executable is part of my year. And then the rest is about engaging, the hearts, the guts, and the hands in terms of capability to go from, architecture into action.
Mm. Beautiful. And I love that. And I'm super keen to chat to you also about how execution loops back to strategy. Where the interplay is between strategy and execution. And we just actually just this week. I mean, people will probably be listening to you a week or two behind, but people will be able to go and listen to Ben Thompson, the founder and CEO of Employment Hero.
Yeah.
He's just been published recently, and he had a very clear master plan for that business. And actually, that strategy really didn't change a hell of a lot, other than the strategic agility as they grew
Mm.
to focus on the right things, the right priorities for every 90-day period, taking into account what was actually changing, how the business was evolving because it was growing so fast. You have constantly having to adapt. But the master plan really didn't change. And I think they're now on sort of master plan 2 or 3, if you like. But to
Yeah.
your point, it's not a 150-page document. It's just had some excellent, robust thinking about the problem, about the customer, about the market, and where they should be playing. So, look, I'm keen to get stuck into the how today. Like the how you get other people thinking about strategy. What Just before we start there, almost philosophically, if you like, before we get into the how do you like to think about, or how do you even talk about what is strategy or what it represents when you sort of really boil it down to a nub?
Yeah. I mean, everyone's probably encountered definitions from Michael Porter and the like. And, I think for me, I'm always on a bit of a personal pathway of how do I take the complex pathway to using simple, plain speak. And at the end of the day, for me, it is about having intention to want better for the
Mm.
future, and then having the attention to step into that future. And what is required as part of that is having both a combination of why you exist, why you're in the business to start with, and for a lot of founders and startups, that's kind of all you start with in most cases is this burning ambition to say this is why I'm getting into the business that I am. But to
Mm.
then combine that kind of timeless reason for why you exist with, what does success look like for me in the next passage of time? And for a small startup, that might be, making it to the next 6 months or 12 months. And as you start to grow and evolve, it's then starting to cast the eye out into a longer term view over the next 2 to 3 years and saying, what would success look like? What's the kind of, and many people would have heard of a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. What's a big, hairy, audacious goal for the future? And then are there kind of 3 to 5 proof points that you would see on a footy match scoreboard that would make it true? Um,
Mm.
and really getting obsessed with that ambition and that story, and then saying, well, how are we going to do that? We've got a sense of the why and the where to. How are we going to do that? And that really then is about looking at how are we going to attract, retain, grow, and develop the best people that will represent that purpose and vision in service of attracting, retaining, and growing the customer lifetime value of those that we're wanting to bring into our ecosystem. Once we have a clear view on that, is then saying, okay, strategy is about making tough choices. We can't make all the choices in the world because we don't have infinite resources or time. Let's get really tough and ruthless around 3 to 5 big bet choices where we're going to over index on our funding, our resources, and building our capabilities, our muscles to be able to be, excellent in that. Now that can be in terms of, the employee attraction, retainment, and growth. It can be in terms of systems and processes that you're investing in to strengthen your organization, or it could be external priorities in terms of really being clear on segmentation or knowing which segments you're going to go after, and also starting to
Mm.
interrogate your growth pathways rather than saying I want to realize X% in revenue or profitability. Being really clear around the quality of that revenue. What are the sources of those revenue going to come from, and how will we go through it? Is it through new customers? Is it through new product development? Is it through new geographies? Is it through organic growth? Is it through partnerships with others? Is it through acquisition? And just being deeply curious beyond the number, which is fantastic. If we think about a footy match, I'd like to say that if you're going to get 100 on the scoreboard in a rugby union match, I'd much rather get 100 points on the scoreboard playing the brand of footy that the New Zealand All Blacks play than maybe some of the other
Mm.
nations play, where they're field goaling and penalty goaling from all different directions without that running rugby. So that's a long explanation that probably goes a bit beyond the Michael Porter definition, but it's a combination of why do we exist, where are we going, how are we going to get there, and what are the big bet strategic priorities that are going to help us
Yeah.
in making that leap.
I can't remember who called them winning moves. I think it might have been the rhythm systems guys, but I like that kind of concept of those 3 to 5. Those big strategic pieces. To your point, where you've got to rally resources, you can't do everything. And one of the things I always talk to about with my clients is if you spend the next 5 years doing exactly the same thing, you may scale the business further. But the question is, what are your competitors doing that is actually strategically differentiating them? So in 5 years, they've been doubling down on something that you haven't been doubling down on, and now they own that space, that strategy, that customer, that problem, that whatever it is. They're going to be materially more, competitive than you are, and your business might be bigger, but it's actually probably at risk.
Absolutely.
And so you have to be doing that sort of that deeper thinking, to be thinking about what are we going to over index on, not how we're just going to do more of the same, but actually how we're going to be a much better business over the course of that period.
Absolutely. I think there's I always reflect back on this one strategy offsite I was running in Adelaide. I think would have been the latter part of the first week of March 2020. And I remember scanning the external environment and the competitor landscape, and the executive team, they were taking it seriously, but it kind of felt a bit more like a formality before they kind of got to the crux of the inner belly of the organization and making strategy from within the organization. And obviously, I remember getting off the flight back to Sydney, where I was living at the time, and just the world changed. And so, I'd say more so than ever, organizations, again, regardless of size or industry, and particularly for founders in the fast moving context, really needing to have what I'd call an outside in perspective to understand what's happening in their external environment, and acknowledging
Mm.
that, whilst they're sharpening the saw from within and harnessing and honing their skills and their capabilities and their, employee value prop, their customer value prop, and, their engagement with, investors and the like, is that they also need to be really thinking deeply about what's happening in the field of play outside in the broader ecosystem, because it's moving at fast pace. And it's becoming incredibly hard to set a strategy for more than 3 years, because honestly, the last
Yeah,
2 years, no one could have ever predicted, including myself.
100%. We For those who are interested, if you're thinking about strategy and you like this conversation just as a starting point, you should also go right back to the beginning. I don't know what episode it was, but Rashad Tabakawala, who was the group head of strategy for Publicis, which has 82,000 employees around the world, and I was asking him his thoughts on strategy, and he said, it's fundamentally competitive advantage. And like you said, he's like, well, you actually have to look out into the future. It's not about the navel gazing and just going, hey, it's great. We've got this widget. We could sort of slightly move it this way. And it's like, that's great. But the world outside you is changing a hell of a lot. And that's not about getting obsessed with your competitors where all of a sudden you fall into the trap of copying what they're doing and trying to do everything just a little bit better. Because that's a strategy to nowhere, right? Like that's a strategy to zero profitability. And you're basically just lagging everyone. So how do you think about that? Because you're really challenging your clients to think about the external environment, but not get so locked into what everybody else is doing that they're feeling that sense of loss. Like got a bit of FOMO because those guys have got this thing and we don't have that. How do you navigate that with the client?
Yeah, I mean, I probably link it to the reading that I do, Sean, because I was a terrible reader in high school in my early 20s, and um, I remember deciding at a certain point that I wanted to be the type of person that read a book a week, and I didn't know how I was going to solve for that. But I'm a pretty good runner, and decided to kind of, as James Clear would call it, the habit stacking. I decided to do a bunch of audiobooks as I was, running and commuting into the city and the like, and so as does the Audible algorithm do it, you start off in the strategy and leadership sphere and you end up reading about, philosophy and Buddhism and plants and all other interesting wild things. So I do borrow from a lot of, and thanks to Audible and Amazon for sending me down that pathway of not reading your typical HBR articles and the like, where the insights are fantastic, but somewhat, either heard before or quite predictable. I was doing some reading and learning up on the three Hindu gods of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And, there's some huge wisdom that comes through from those three Hindu gods in terms of the creation of new, the preservation and strengthening of existing, and also the letting go or the death, or as it's termed, destruction of the past. And this kind of combination of renewal that is expressed through the three Hindu gods has huge relevance at this point in history where we really need to be looking at creating, new ways of working internally, new ways of creating and delivering value to customers and clients, and new ways of engaging in the commercial market as well in terms of for founders and startups, how you engage investors and partners, and for those that are wanting to make the leap from a kind of founder-led business to one that is, listed in the stock exchange, it requires a really genuine commitment to being in the rumble with those three Hindu gods, if I can use that term. And so when making decisions around strategic priorities, you want to see the elements of all three in there, where it's like, what are we actually doing that is really new and compelling? What is it that we currently do that are our superpowers that we want to sharpen the saw on and continue to invest in? And as we grow and we increase our scope and our span, how do we be ruthless around what we let go of that won't serve our future?
Wow, and that just gets harder and harder as the business gets bigger, right? You got more people with more expectation. You probably got more investors. You got all these extra pressures. How did you? One of the things that Robbie said to me was that one of the big insights for them out of the work with you guys was almost that are we in the right business kind of conversation? Like, the way he described it to me, and you might have a different view. And I know that a lot of businesses who have, I reckon out of probably 40 or 50% of the businesses who I've spoken to have ended up scaling. And of course, as the business is scaling, you end up sort of feeding the machine on the same sort of model. But of course, then you're having to find new customer types and new revenue types, and the products expand a little bit. And there's this risk of becoming a bit generic and trying to be everything to everyone when you probably started relatively niche, solving one problem, and now you're just trying to sort of feed the beast. And there seems to be this sort of plateau stage where you go, hang on a second, profitability is getting squeezed. We've all of a sudden become generic. We're actually no longer competitive. And to your point, this opportunity to really renew and go, hang on, maybe there's one customer type out of all these customer types we should really, dig down on and actually be the experts in. We had this conversation with Chris Eldridge in one of the early episodes. They built up, I think, to about 40 mil and got their IT services sort of business, got exactly to that space, and then realized actually their biggest opportunity, the customer they most liked, that they got on with the best, that had the greatest value, where they could solve the biggest problem, was like super funds. So they doubled down on super funds and actually started solving really discrete problems in super funds, became the experts in super funds, and actually such that over the next 3 to 5 years, nobody could compete with them because all the super funds knew that these were the guys you go to because they're the ones who understand their industry and their problems and all the rest. And so but that process of letting go, to your point, when you've got this big beast that you're sort of serving, it takes a lot of courage as a founder. What kind of conversations did you get into with Robbie? Because my understanding was they got to a point where they thought they were in the platforms business and the lead generation business. And so they had all these multiple lead generation businesses going. But actually then through this process, they realized they'd sort of forgotten about their core customer, which was the tradie. And so they doubled down on how do we serve this tradie customer better? And they went into developing all this, software for, I guess, to help them run their business, not just generate leads for them. And that's seen the business, double over the subsequent years. Tell me about that conversation.
Yeah, certainly. So I won't get into the particulars of the industry, and I'll de-identify it from Robbie and the team. That's a scenario that has been commonplace for me over the years. And I mean, what I always think of, and this is where it comes back to that kind of theme, and I know I'm probably oversimplifying it by calling it traffic control, but it really is that in the case that I always find myself in a room with people that are much smarter than me. And so what I really do focus on is being a process facilitator rather than a content facilitator. I am never going in with the answer. And in fact, I make the point immediately, and particularly post 2020, of saying, I'm not the expert of anything. I've got no idea what's going on. I have really, we're in a new territory. We've got one foot in the old story, and our foot is stepping into a new story here. So we're going to have to create the space for curiosity rather than expertise. What got us to here is not going to get us to there. And so, when I look at a founder-led business, a startup, even with an executive team, but kind of looking to make it to that next step, or to go from let's say a $5 or $10 million business to a 20 or 30 million or even more, is when you've got the executives in the room, you've got a microcosm of the business, of the system in that room. And so how they behave with one another is a reflection of how their organization or their business is operating in their ecosystem, in their industry. And so what I would really encourage here is that, if that executive team or that group of leaders or the two founders that have started a business together and are kind of discussing their future, is they need to really reflect on the way that they're operating together as a team. And this is where there's a connection between strategy and leadership. Ariana Huffington calls it compassionate directness, I think. And, it's a kind of also known as like radical candor, or just, really over-indexing on both deep care and deep challenge. And so within any of those contexts, because I'm relatively polite and I don't use a loud tone of voice, I get away with being quite direct with groups. And, I've often been known to say that, if you're going to really come up with a clear plan that is courageous and is going to take you to the next step, you've got to be in the rumble when you're having these conversations. You've got to learn how to disagree with each other respectfully, and you've got to be able to call out the conversations that matter. So for me, even though a lot of leadership teams and founders that I'm working with believe that we're setting strategy when I come into the room, we're also working on taking their top team to the next level. And I see them as one and the same. If you're not evolving as a team, it's impossible to evolve with your strategy, because you've got the system in the room that are not willing to say the things that matter, that are trying to preserve and protect the past, and being unwilling to let go of things that won't serve the future. So there's a lot of the human elements that play into that, that are incredibly important. So interesting that, your question kind of angled a bit more towards the industry and, the type of business that Robbie was in, and, from platform to another position. I really I really tapped into the human element of how that executive team were working together, which unlocked their
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, not mine.
Mm, mm, I love that. So if you think about, I imagine you've obviously got a process, and
Mm,
even though I hadn't quite said, "Hey, give me the steps," you've pretty much outlined the steps for us, right?
mm.
And really nicely and simply. So thank you for that. There's always questions that that are coming. So you're working on the team, you're trying to get them in the right psychology, trying to get
Yeah.
them into the right space in the room to hear probably some of the harder questions. What are some of the hard questions that you find really sort of stop the room and have people go, "Oh, like that's a big question, or it's a deep question," or really you find it really starts to shift people's thinking? What are some of those go-to questions that you think our founders might get value from?
I mean, starting with, I think the very fact of engaging someone that's external to help with strategy is a real struggle for founders. I know with the kind of founder-led businesses that have kind of started out of your typical garage scenario, highly intellectual, highly entrepreneurial individuals, they have all of the answers. They can already see 10 years down the track what their business will look like. Um, it's very hard for founders to understand that to scale your business to the next level, it won't be because of that individual leading the organization. They really have a role to drive what we'd call distributed leadership, bringing people into the journey, to help in sharing, making the decisions, and then acknowledging that, once you actually have a compelling strategy that has the input of, your business unit leads or your functional leads, regardless if you're still in a small operation, got at least 5 or 6 different voices in that room. It's incredibly important to get that input and buy-in. Once you've got a strategy, it's in, I think, and I don't know that I'm answering your question here, so I'm going to try and steer it back, but it's really hard for a founder to understand that you need a strategy in the first place, because what a strategy looks like for a founder is often back of the envelope after a couple of drinks of
Mm,
whiskey with a good mate. And when you get to a certain size and scale, I mean, you think of the Dunbar number of, like, societies or, tribes coming together. Once you get to a number of 150 people in a tribe, the system starts to break down because it gets too loose and too large and unable to kind of work cohesively. And I'd say that Dunbar number for
mm,
an organization is probably even less. Once you get to kind of 50, you can't rely on gut
mm.
instinct and intuition and people just giving you a look and knowing what to do next. So I think the challenging
Yeah.
question for a founder is like, what's the value of having a strategy that exists outside of the mind of the founder or founders? And once you're starting to get to a certain size and scale in terms of revenue and number of staff, is that strategy is not going to be realized by the top leaders. You actually have to go through the process of, you know, first of all, the cognitive, the head, understanding what is the strategy, but then engaging the hearts of those who are going to be driving the strategy. You then have to tap into the guts in terms of what is required for us to balance between delivering today in terms of our BAU or business as usual, and also making space for building the future. And I think that's a real challenge for a lot of founders and for kind of rapidly
Mm,
growing businesses, is you get caught up in the timeline of what decisions am I making for this week to get an outcome. Whereas strategy is kind of, about how many of my decisions in a week are contributing towards year 2 or year 3 of our next
mm.
horizon. Um, and then Sean, just the execution capabilities. It's like, going beyond the PDF document that gathers dust to go, actually, we want this to be a rhythm. Everyone uses the word operating rhythm, which is just like, it's kind of almost just a natural language for everyone in any business. What's our operating rhythm?
Mm,
I really feel like we need more space for a conversation around strategy rhythm, and how do we make sure that we're taking deliberate times out to say, how are we tracking against our purpose and our vision, our value proposition, our strategic priorities? Who's taking ownership of our priorities, and who's implementing the initiatives? What are we executing on successfully? And how are we becoming a learning organization, acknowledging that strategy is not just about executing, but it's also about learning along the way. So I reckon I've answered maybe a tenth of your question and then just gone off on a meandering journey. So feel free to rein me
Well,
back in.
actually, no, what it leads us to is a really interesting conversation about, because my next question was about how do we take strategy into execution, and where does execution reinform strategy, and how often are you encouraging leaders to think
Yeah.
about the renewal and the sort of deep thinking? Because obviously, when you're setting up strategy in the first place, it tends to be a pretty deep thinking process, takes a fair bit of time. And not everybody wants to be doing that every 3 months, because that's probably not very economical, and you haven't executed much yet. So,
Yeah.
how do you think about the sort of feedback loop between them?
Yeah. So I think as you've mentioned, I've alluded to kind of the strategy architecture, the strategy alignment, and then the strategy action. And I think also with understanding where the strategic maturity of the organization is at is really important. So to meet the group where they're at is to say, well, some organizations, some startups, some founder-led businesses believe that strategy is your back of the envelope or the idea that sits in your head. Others might have a strategy which actually is more like a 12-month operational plan. And then others might actually have one that genuinely is like a 3-year strategy, which articulates those the why, the where to, the how, and the what, with some execution plans and timelines, and teams that are mobilized around those. So meeting the organization where they're at in terms of their strategic maturity is really important. I've worked with a lot of organizations that have gone, yeah, we've done strategy for years, but actually it is actually quite a basic, operational plan. And so giving them the context and understanding of what a strategy is important. For some organizations, however, they've been really robust in having a very comprehensive strategy, and sometimes to their detriment, having the 150-page version that you talked to earlier. And then it is about saying, fantastic, we've got a really well-articulated, rigorous strategy. What's the next step? And quite often there's a gap in terms of acknowledging that strategy requires mythology, it requires narrative, it requires story, it requires engagement between people who are going to interact with this strategy. So whether that's leadership team members talking to their direct team, or to cross-functional teams, or to their customers or clients, or to their partners, or linking it in with their branding messaging to the market, is that strategy as a document is pointless. It's a nice, theoretical exercise, and a couple of leaders might elevate their level of strategic understanding, but it's not going to translate into meaningful action. They don't know how to socialize it in their conversations. So making strategy part of conversation in the everyday is a really important thing in terms of, kind of quite structured. You might see, like, in larger organizations, you might call it like a town hall or like a roadshow where they go and, share the new strategy. For a smaller business, for a founder-led business, or a startup, it is about, it could be just to the point of like, hey, how do I go from holding the strategy in my head as the founder or as the founders to kind of actually start practicing telling the story to others that are part of the business? And I've always kind of said, you never know how little or how much you know until you try to articulate it to someone else. So for founders, I would really say is that your strategy is obvious to you. You got into the business and you knew what your strategy was. To really take your business to the next level, you need to be able to articulate that strategy so that people understand it, and so they actually give a shit about the strategy, and they know what the direct line of sight is between what they'll do every day and how that ladders up to the big picture.
Can you give me an example, Jamie, of how you get someone, a founder maybe who hasn't done much communicating of strategy, to create the, I guess, the connectivity, the sense of connection to it, the interest, to your point, that the hearts and the guts of the people on the ground who are like, well, I've never heard anything about strategy before. Like, why are we having this conversation? How do you get them to sort of bridge that gap and get them to think about how to make it more real? Is there an example you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that as part of the strategy process with an executive team, it is always built in at the end of these processes to get the leaders to think about, okay, great, we're set with the strategy, we're going to sign off on the strategy. Now, how are we going to tell the story? And so what you'll start to find is we'll actually just practice, in a risk-free environment, and just go, some of you are going to be natural storytellers. Some of you are going to be horrible storytellers, and I can guarantee I've encountered everything in between that. And it's acknowledging that for a founder who is genuine about scaling their business, or pair of founders, is that um, everyone has to be able to tell the story. And I think there is a sense that once the strategy has been realized, that it's just going to be the founder that tells the story. And typically, by personality type, they're quite engaging, they're entrepreneurial, they're able to inspire the hearts of others. But if you are scaling a business and you are opening the reins to other leaders being part of the mix in helping to grow the business, everyone needs to be able to tell the story. And now this is not about memorizing the strategy and knowing how to perfectly articulate everything that has been carefully wordsmithed. It is about being able to tell the authentic story of the strategy in a way that suits your style and that suits also the person who's the recipient of the story. So if
Mm.
you're telling your direct team, you've got to be able to articulate how this one page strategy that articulates your why, your where to, your how, and your what, how that relates to the day to day for the team. Or indeed, if you're talking with a partner, it's got to really talk to the partnership element in terms of a strong partnership embodying a shared sense of that why and a shared sense of that ambition for the goal that you're working towards and what their role is in
Mm.
supporting the value proposition. And so acknowledging the role of, it's almost, I'd say, that strategy that has been developed as a document is the cheat sheet for rich dialogue. And so I don't think it's something that
I
people
like that.
develop immediately, but it's certainly
Mm.
something that executive teams or founders with a couple of additional leaders that they've added to the business are really having to get quite effective at. And we only have to look as far as the likes of Amazon and other kind of world-class organizations at the moment. They're not investing in the 30-page reports at their executive and board meetings. They're investing in, what's the story you're going to tell? Tell us a story that moves us, and that inspires the next steps of
Mm.
the direction. Boards want to be inspired as well, not just teams and organizations. And so for founders who are looking for, that have a board or are looking for investors, also acknowledging that strategy is incredibly important for being able to get further funding or to be able to get further buy-in from the board to approve certain next steps.
Mm. How often do you uh, how often do you see or do you encourage clients to talk about strategy with customers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think for me, it's a bit like with, I don't know, for some of your listeners, Sean, some of them might have done some leadership diagnostics and they kind of answer the 150 questions or whatever it might be that gives them like a personality profile or, their leadership
Mm.
effectiveness or whatever it might be. And quite often I get the question in debriefs around that, which says, well, is it my work self or is it my personal self? Is it my home self? And I would view it as kind of one and the same, really. So, with regards to strategy, I quite often get a similar question, which is, well, is this strategy for us to kind of keep as a secret internally in our organization, or is it one
That's where I was
that
going. Yeah.
ladders up to marketing and branding and shooting from the tops of buildings? And listen, I think again, meeting the organization where they're at. Um, is I would be saying if you're not prepared to develop a strategy that you'd be able to have a conversation with your client or customer about, then perhaps it is not very customer focused. If
Mm.
and I think I always acknowledge as well from a competitive viewpoint as well. I always think of the example of Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk, from what I understand, and I'm not so close to the detail, but I did see recently he said that he doesn't patent a bunch of his technology, and that if there's someone out there that can leverage and build upon that technology and that Tesla goes bankrupt, well, then he thinks that's a pretty cool thing for the world. So I feel like in a post 2020 world, I feel like we need to be stepping beyond scarcity mindset to be
Mm.
lifting the bar collectively. And, for founders, I'd obviously there is an aspiration to, you know, expand the revenue growth and the commercial value of your entity, but to think about how, in what way is that servicing the broader industry in which you're a part of? How is that contributing to the betterment of society, both today and in the future? So I'm always of the view, I take a bias towards saying I unapologetically put it out there. And, many people have tried to replicate the Apple strategy and failed because they just don't have the
Yeah.
same, the DNA and makeup as Apple have. So
Mm,
I'm of the view that it should always be both internal and external. And again, the story that
yeah.
you tell is nuanced.
Is nuanced. Yeah. That's such a, I love the challenge that you've got in that question around, well, how focused is the customer? How customer oriented is this strategy if you can't talk about it with a customer? And I also think, if you don't have the customers, I mean, I've been in lots of strategy sessions over my time, and there's been lots of them where there's been no customer input in the room. There's been no research done. None of the executives are talking to the customers, and none of the people who are on the ground are talking to the customers who are in the room. And you're like, we're doing this in a vacuum. And so, in the absence of being able to talk to a customer about strategy, which is theoretically about how you serve those customers better, how do the people who are actually doing the execution get feedback from the customer about where the customer goes, yeah, but that's not really what's going on in my industry. That's not really my problem. Like my problem is this, and you guys aren't solving it that way. And so you're not getting that. You're not creating the opportunity for the feedback and the input. And to me, that's the biggest risk is if you don't
Agree.
have that, if you're not tuned into what's going on with your customers, you can have the greatest strategy you think in the world. But if it's like you cut a point in time and you go, okay, that's the strategy, and now we're just going to execute that for 3 years, and then we're going to
100%.
wake up in 3 years and everything's going to be perfect, and everyone's going to go, wow, that was incredible. The customers could have completely changed during that time in terms of what they want, how they're getting their problems solved, who they're getting them solved by, and so it has to be adaptive.
Absolutely agree.
Um,
Everyone really follows the song sheet of Amazon's customer obsession. You know, Imagine a world in which organizations of all sizes and scales walked alongside their customer to co-design a strategy together that services the customer. It kind of seems pretty basic to me, but requires some real courage at the same time.
Yeah, geez, that's beautiful. I remember listening to a podcast some time ago where this guy had been really successful in all these marketing gigs and become a big sort of marketing influence. And he said, well, the only thing that I did that made me successful was in every single job. The first thing I did was I blocked out the first 2 weeks of my diary and I
Mm,
rang 300 customers. And he said, and I didn't do a thing before I did any of that. I'm like, just give me the list of customers and I'm going to call people until I actually understand what is going on with them. And he, of course, had knowledge that there was nobody else who could say, well, I know what the customers are doing. He's like, I've just spoken to 300 of them. I know exactly what the problem is.
exactly.
Now let's have a look at the business and see how well we are lined up to service that challenge.
And looking at that, that's a huge amount of investment of time. But if we think of that notion of slow is smooth and smooth is fast, if we slow down to really deeply understand the problem we're trying to solve, we'll have disproportionate
Mm,
impact, later down the track.
mm. So interesting, mate. We are getting close to time, and God, I've got 1,000 more questions for you. So we might have to do a round two in a year's time, and see what's been happening in your world. What else do you think, if you put your mind in the audience where we've got these founders, typically anywhere from probably 1 to 20 mil. A lot of them are services founders. They're trying to sort of scale up their business.
Mm.
What are the things that you'd really like to leave them with? Questions, a process, key advice of a couple of things that you think are really important for them to think about if they really want to optimize the next 3 years in terms of their time, and fundamentally the quality of the questions they're asking themselves are dictating the work that everybody is doing. And so,
Yeah.
really important that they are thinking about this sort of stuff sensibly. What would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, certainly, Sean. And this is not an all-inclusive list, but just a few thoughts would be acknowledging where the leaders of these startups are at in their journey as individuals as well. Acknowledging that they started off, as technical leaders, with hands on the tools, doing the technical task, and they've obviously become really proficient and effective in doing so. As their business grows, they're going to have to become really proficient and effective in engaging the hearts and minds of others. And as the business continues to grow, you then start to move into this enterprise leadership space and having to think big picture, holistically, long term, whole versus parts, short term versus long term, growth versus profitability. And I think for founders, it really does require those clear career transitions. Even though you've avoided the corporate landscape, you still do go through those career transitions of technical expertise to people leadership to strategic or enterprise leadership. So being really clear on what do I need to do to get off the tools, delegate to others so that I can focus on engaging the hearts and minds. And then once you've got people managers, people leaders in your business, is how do you free up your space? Like you said, Sean, to get in front of the customer, get deeply curious, start thinking about longer term, bigger picture decisions to be making. Second thought, and it's probably more a summary of what we've covered in our earlier discussion, is having the architecture of a strategy is not enough. You need to be able to go into the storytelling, create a mythology and an energy across your organization and with your customers, with your partners, and even in the ecosystem, visible to your competitors, about what you stand for and what you're up for in the future. And then building the kind of the cadence, the rhythm to execute the strategy. And this is where I'd really tap into the likes of James Clear, who wrote the book on Atomic Habits. Is, for founder-led organizations, quite often a highly entrepreneurial individual or, set of individuals that have started a business are quite intuitive and tend to be less structured, is that, you're going to have to get the scaffolding in place to allow for that creativity and entrepreneurialism to continue to be available to you. Make sure you have a level of standardization and people who can be detailed and structured around you so that you can continue to shine through with your brilliance. The final thing I'd say, Sean, is just, in the world that we're in now, is I like to refer to as like captains and pirates in strategy. So captains is that you have a clear plan, you know where you're going, there's going to be headwinds and tailwinds, you've got to mobilize a crew. But also acknowledging, when I was in Adelaide in March 2020, the whole world changed. And, when the whole world changes and you don't know what's happening, you can't plan for anything, there's a benefit of taking on a bit of a pirate mindset and being opportunistic and being able to slow down, hear the sights, the smells, the sounds, be curious, let go of expertise, and discover what is emerging before anyone else does. There are a few thoughts. I could keep going, but I'll pause for fear of monologue.
Well, that was awesome. I'm still processing them all and thinking about all of these this great wisdom in the context of some of my clients who I know would absolutely get huge value from today's conversation. Jamie, such a joy getting to finally have this conversation. Thank you so much. I'm definitely keen to have more in the future, so we'll be inviting you back. How do people get in touch with Maximus, find out what you're doing? Where would you direct them to?
Absolutely, yeah. Maximus International, you'll find them online. Yeah, love to have another chat with you, Sean, and we'll see you in the future.
Mate, sounds great. Folks, really hope you've enjoyed the show today with Jamie Christopherson from Maximus International. Thank you so much, Jamie. Obviously, we love reviews. If you feel like doing a review, we'd be super grateful. There is a team of people behind me who help put the show together, and they really get a huge kick out of it. So thank you for all those people who send in reviews. You can find us on scaleupspodcast.com. We've got full transcripts of all the episodes there. You can find it on YouTube if you like the visual version, or you can find us on all the socials, and you'll see some little videograms, little snippets of this conversation popping out on the different socials over the course of time. Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you, everybody. We'll speak with you again next week.
Thanks, Sean.
G'day everyone, just a couple of quick things before you go. If you have questions that you'd love myself or an upcoming guest to tackle about challenges that you're facing in scaling your business, please just jump straight on the website, scaleupspodcast.com. You can record your message straight from your mobile by hitting the button on the right-hand side of the page, or you can just email them the old-fashioned way, questions@scaleupspodcast.com. And just a quick reminder, nothing we spoke about today constitutes financial or business advice. If you are considering making big decisions in your business, seek out a professional who can look at your situation in detail and make sure you're getting sound, personalised advice. Thanks for listening. Look forward to being back in your podcast feed next week.